is Cory Jobb, and I am an assistant professor in the early childhood education program at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, British Columbia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adrienne Argent, and I teach in the Faculty of Early Childhood Care and Education at Capilano University. I'm also a post-secondary institute pedagogist with the Early Childhood Pedagogy Network, and my work is situated at the Children's Center, which is an early learning center and a lab school setting at the Capilano University campus in North Vancouver.
I'm Tessa McDonnell. I recently completed my ECE at Capilano University, and I'm now working there in an on-call position. This fall, I'm going back to complete my degree.
The three of us are joining together today for a conversation, but before we do, I first want to share a little bit about our intentions for this conversation today. We're going to spend a few minutes introducing some ideas that are important for how we understand the work of early childhood educators, and these are ideas that have inspired a great deal of interest and even disagreement within early childhood education. I'm going to start us off by introducing curriculum and pedagogy as two concepts and practices that matter for early childhood education, and then Adrienne is going to introduce documentation or pedagogical narration. And then we're going to have a conversation with Tessa about how she activates these practices in her work as an educator. It might help if we begin by thinking about education as a long-term social project. By this, we mean that education is something that matters for every member of society. It's something that we all have a vested interest in. Education is one way that people come to understand themselves and their place in the world, and how education is put into practice continues to be a subject for long-standing debate. Relatedly, curriculum and pedagogy are two words that you will become very familiar with during your time as a student of early childhood education, but if we can offer a very brief and a very limited description, we might think of curriculum as the what of teaching and learning, and we might think of pedagogy as the how or the why. From a constructionist perspective, which is another term that you're going to become familiar with as you go deeper into your studies, these are situated, responsive, and emergent processes, meaning they unfold over time in response to particular conditions. Curriculum is something that educators and children make, while pedagogy is the orientations or the dispositions that drive those curricular choices. So, for example, if you as an educator were concerned about racism and how it shows up in early childhood education, you might say that you're orienting yourself pedagogically around contesting racism, while your curriculum thinking or the curriculum that you make refers to the ways that you would go about making visible how you contest racism in your everyday practices with children and colleagues.
To follow up on Cory's discussion regarding curriculum and pedagogy, I wanted to speak about the purpose of pedagogical documentation, or pedagogical narration, as it is sometimes referred to. The BC Early Learning Framework is going to be living across all of your courses in very specific ways. And as you begin to explore the framework, you will begin to see how curriculum and documentation are interconnected. They inform each other. They're always shaping and reshaping our understanding of what it means to think and co-create curriculum alongside children. The framework reminds us that learning does not happen in isolation. It describes learning as something that happens always in relation with people, materials, and the places that we live and learn. So what does this mean for you as students and future educators? As you will learn in your curriculum theory courses and through your practicum experiences, documentation involves noticing and becoming curious about the diverse ways that children are thinking together and co-constructing knowledge. Documentation involves gathering together traces. And when I talk about traces, I mean ideas, drawings, photos, video clips, questions, notational descriptions of exchanges and dialogue that happen between children and educators, between children and materials, and children and land, or a sense of place. Documentation is a process that allows us to compose rich and puzzling questions to guide our curriculum intentions. It allows us to map out trajectories and notice when to pause and linger with ideas or creative problems as they emerge. Documentation also allows us to listen to the voices of particular materials, such as paint, clay, or drawing, just to name a few. To notice how these materials participate and encourage various types of relationships and connections. Materials always give form to ideas in different ways. Slowly over time, these traces begin to work together to tell a very specific story about the life that is unfolding within an early years setting. It also tells a story about the pedagogical values and commitments that educators hold. And as you dig into the framework and engage with the values and the theories that are held within it, you will notice that listening, critical reflection, and collaborative dialogue are at the heart of documentation and curriculum making processes. We, as in myself, Cory, and Tessa, we want you to know and really embrace as a student that documentation and curriculum making is always a collective process. It involves multiple perspectives. It's not an individual act. And as a student, you will be learning how to collaborate and how to think with others, because this is an essential quality to becoming an early childhood educator. It's also a way of being with children, a way of learning in partnership. Through documentation, we convey to children that as their educators, we are there to think with them and that we care deeply for their ideas. Documentation is not to be confused with removed or objective observations or a form of evaluation or assessment of what children know or what they don't know. Rather, documentation, when taken up in slow and careful ways, it generates new insights rather than reproducing an already known understanding of who a child is. The stories that are told through documentation are critically important to the project of early childhood education. These stories make the complexity of our relationships with children known in the broader community. These stories also open up new dialogues and resist a singular image for who a child can be, but also what it means to care and educate children in our current contexts, always in relation to 21st century concerns and the events that are happening in the world. And now we will turn our attention to Tessa and hear some stories from her experience as a practicum student.
We've noticed a lot of the kinds of questions and maybe trepidations around practicum and what it means to start working with educators and what it means to start working with young children for many students for the very first time. So we have a couple of questions for you today. And our first one is, what does it mean to enter into existing pedagogical and curricular worlds? And how do you look for openings for the kinds of dispositions you want to nurture?
When we enter into a classroom, we're starting in the middle. So we don't just suddenly create something from nothing. We are starting in response to something that already matters and exists in the classroom. And this is what carries you as the practicum student. In my specific instance, the room I was stepping into had strong existing pedagogical values that sort of underpinned all the work that they were doing with children in the room. And this was in the form of a manifesto that lived on the wall in the room. And this was where the educators collaboratively worked to create a base, something to ground them all in, something that connects all the educators and children. And it also informs how we engage with children and materials. And so when you're stepping into the room as a practicum student and you have this to ground you, it gives you an opening already because you understand where the room is situated and where you can situate yourself within that as well. So then you're able to find this middle and you can work to create a curriculum that holds this strong image of a child and seeks to work along and think alongside children.
One of the other things that we notice often with students and with students as becoming educators is over time, as they progress through our programs, their ideas shift. Their perceptions of what it means to work with children, their perceptions of what it means to work with fellow educators are unsettled. I'm wondering if you could speak to your experiences there and speak to how working with children and fellow educators unsettled or shifted the ideas that you may have held before beginning your work as a student educator.
Prior to starting as a student educator, I definitely had a narrow image of the child in general, probably because no one had ever contested it or challenged me on it, because I think that the way that the education system is set up, they don't want you to question that. And you're not supposed to, because once you hit elementary school, that's sort of like where you start or where you begin. But there's so much before that I was able to be a part of and witness. And that really shifted my way of thinking. When you're existing in a classroom where educators and children work alongside each other, that was the first big shift for me, as it made me rethink what children are capable of and then what the role of the educator actually is. In this setting, the educators challenge the children, asking them questions that they themselves don't know. And then in return, the children challenge the educators because they take us down new paths that open up room for emerging and collective ideas and investigations. I think the biggest thing that I've learned is I don't know, meaning I no longer feel the need to know everything when working with children. Sometimes I feel like there's a bit of a preconceived idea that adults know everything and then these children know nothing and we're here to fill them up. They have nothing, which is not at all the case. Big thing that I was asking myself was, who does it benefit to ask children questions that we already know the answers to? So where I was in my practicum, the environment there really cultivated and held a shared commitment to this beauty of uncertainty. And it left space for both educators and children to constantly be in the process of becoming. It's not something you just suddenly reach and then you're done. And so to be able to go alongside that journey with one another was a really special thing that has carried and stayed with me as I've moved forward as an educator.
Thank you, Tessa. I really appreciate your point about asking questions that you yourself don't know the answer to. I think that's so significant in how we make a shift toward constructing knowledge together with children and with our fellow educators. One last question for you. I'm wondering, what are you trying to make visible or call attention toward in your curriculum making practices? Meaning, what matters to you? And then secondly, how does documentation support you in your thinking and in your doing?
Documentation is where ideas are able to live and to be seen and to be worked with and challenged. So when I was on Practicum, the children's center that I was in started utilizing something called a conversation board, which was just like a big board that lived in the classroom that we were able to collectively work on. So educators and children would add photos and notes that I've taken, notes that other educators have taken, notes that children have taken, drawings, all these sorts of traces lived on this board. And so they were always alive and visible in the room, which meant that the ideas could be visited and revisited and changed and challenged. Conversation boards really became places of gathering and invitation because they offered these glimpses and invitations and questions, and they were fluid and they were opportunities for exchanges between children. In the room that I was in, which was a toddler room, what I was really trying to focus on were these gestures and glances that happen between children and educators, with the material remaining sort of the connective piece that is linking everyone together. And what was also really important to me was giving space for the nonverbal. And so when children are able to see themselves and their ideas shown back to them, that gives such a value to what they've done. Like, it shows them that their work is important and it does have value. And so this was a really important process for me to be able to understand and sort of narrow down. Curriculum making in this sense is underpinned, I think, by the pedagogy of listening, where there needs to be a real fostering and attending to the sensitivity of each child's ideas and their importance. The relationships that exist in the classroom, the tensions that arise from working materials and alongside one another are all a part of curriculum, and they work alongside each other as the educators do with the children. And so the documentation really is a reflection back of what the curriculum is.
Thank you, Tessa, for joining us today in this conversation and for generously sharing with us your experiences and the significant learning that you gained, and also speaking about what it means to create curriculum in response to pedagogical values and commitments, and what that does to your practice as a becoming educator, and how it shapes you in ways that are rich and meaningful and full of strong ethical dispositions and orientations. Thank you so much for sharing with us. It's been an amazing conversation.